Well, good morning, conference, and welcome to Monday morning. First thing Monday morning, what a good time to be having a debate in the hall here in Bournemouth. Our first debate of the day is F19, Transgender and Intersex Health Charter, which you'll find at page 28 of this document, which is the agenda. Can I also say that anybody who wants to find out the latest and most up-to-date information about conference should pick up their copy of Conference Daily. Today it's a nice green hue. You can get it over at the speaker's table to my right or from any of the stewards. We have no amendments in at all to this debate, so we're going to take a range of speakers. Can I say to start with that although as chair I've got to balance the debate and call people from all different viewpoints, the cards that I've had in are very much on one side of the debate, as you'll see when I call people. That's not me not balancing the debate, that's just the way the cards have come in. Could I ask Helen Belcher, please, to stand by? She is from Wokingham, and I now ask Sarah Noble from Calderdale to come forward and be the first speaker proposing this motion. Sarah.
Good morning, conference. The government seek to safeguard the nature of marriage as an institution for opposite-sex couples. We do not believe that it is acceptable to create even a small category of same-sex marriages. That was David Lammy, the Minister for Constitutional Reform, speaking to the House of Commons on the 25th of May 2004 over the issue of allowing trans people to stay in their marriages. Our own Richard Younger-Ross called the policy cruel and unchristian. Evan Harris took it to a division, and Labour imposed a three-line whip on the issue, and the amendment fell 94 to 303. As a result, 200 loving couples were forced to divorce so that they could access a right the European Court of Human Rights forced Labour to provide so that Labour could segregate gay people from history's oldest and greatest social institution. It's easy to change your name. You can wake up one morning and decide to be called Daenerys Targaryen from Game of Thrones and get that on your passport in a matter of days. But to change your gender, first you need to have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. So if you've got some intersex condition, you're out of luck. You need to be living as your new gender for 2 years. Now, if you've had kids, you're out of luck. Then you need to get permission from your spouse, if you have one. If you're estranged from your spouse, again, you're out of luck. Then you pay £140 to beg a panel, which doesn't need to have people qualified in trans issues speaking on it, sitting on it, to accept your application to change one little letter on your documents. This, we're told, is normal. And even then, we're not afforded the full rights that a cisgender person would be allowed. In equality law, it's explicitly legal to sack a trans person or refuse them access to sheltered accommodation. Corbyn's carriages, however well-intentioned they may be, might end up being a recipe for transphobic crime, especially if certain SNP donors who supported Section 28 have their way. This isn't new when we're talking about gender transition. The waiting, the cost, the jumping through hoops, we have to deal with that every time we go to the doctor. This is despite the NHS saying that healthcare is subject to waiting time standards. In Newcastle, a patient being referred in March 2017 may have to wait 12 years for their first appointment. Not weeks, not months, years. As far as we know, that is the longest waiting list in the country. It's not the fault of the clinics themselves. They literally don't have the money. When PCT budgets were under threat, mental health, and with it, transition healthcare, faced the cut first. Thank God we had Norman Lamb to push for parity of esteem in the last government. For some people, though, it's too late. For example, on July the 26th, Sinestra de Courcy died just days before receiving a referral letter. Faced with her GPs obstructing her, she turned to sex work to afford her hormone replacement therapy. She was raped, she was robbed, and she turned to drug use to find solace, which ended up killing her. She was 23. We just want the rights of everyone else. We want quick access to world-class healthcare, free at the point of service. We want to be free from discrimination. We want to be able to change our names and our genders without unnecessary bureaucracy. We want our friends who don't identify completely as either male or female to be recognised. And we want our doctors to stop mutilating children just because their bodies look strange. Lines 67, 68 and 108 to 111 talk about the unethical and unnecessary medical treatments performed by doctors and surgeons upon intersex children. Lines 75 to 83 talk about the right of non-binary and intersex people to access healthcare. As important as this whole motion is, these are incredibly important. Very few people in politics stand up for either community. The government don't think that people who don't identify within the gender binary suffer any specific detriment despite not being covered by the Equality Act. I want to change that. I want us to be reactive to equality. I want us to be a safe place for trans and intersex people to lobby for their rights. I want us to be the party of equality now and forevermore. We can't rely on other parties. Look at Labour, saying that only they can deliver equality, when their student wing only a few months ago actively tried to block trans representation within the NUS so they can go and have some Pizza Express. The Tories, with their ham-fisted attempts to claim credits for Lynn's same-sex marriage bill while defending the spousal veto to the hilt. UKIP, the only employer to sack someone for their beliefs on same-sex marriage. Or even the Greens, who will stand posh bigots in target seats as long as they give Natalie a few £1,000. We are proud of being the only major party that fully supports human rights. This party has people in every corner of the country willing to stand up for the most deprived people in society. Let us go forward together with a strong and concise message. Vote for this motion so, as every membership card says, no one shall be enslaved by poverty, ignorance or conformity. Thank you, Conference.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. Would Zoe O'Connell from Cambridge please stand by? And I now call Helen Belcher from Wokingham, who wishes to speak in favour of the motion.
Good morning, Conference. As a new member at my first ever party conference, can I not only thank people for being so friendly, but also say that the room looks an awful lot bigger from up here than it does from down there. Trans people's identities in Britain have always been policed by others, whether being allied with homosexuality and treated as illegal by the Victorians in the 1850s, or as possibly insane by psychiatrists from the 1950s onwards. We've allowed people to define who is and who isn't trans. As you've just heard, even now, trans people have to submit medical reports to an anonymous panel for them to determine whether we are who we say we are and permit our official gender to be changed. Underpinning this and feeding media stories over many years is an unsaid insistence that trans people's identities are not real. Trans medicine, by which I mean those treatments focused on an individual changing gender role, trans medicine has been in chaos and underfunded for years. 2 weeks ago, even West London Mental Health Trust CEO admitted that it was a lottery and is not treating trans people equally. Long waiting lists that breach targets have become the norm, so trans people become unwilling to jeopardize precious treatment if they have cause to complain, and many do have cause to complain. Survey after survey shows that 40% of trans people have attempted suicide. This treatment saves lives, but the NHS needs to fund and resource services properly, look for better delivery methods, rather than paying a higher cost for mental health teams and A&E services to pick up the pieces. While the whole motion is important, I'd like to speak specifically to lines 84 and 85. 2 years ago, following the news of a GMC investigation into a popular private doctor who worked in this area, over 1,000 tweets alleging abuse were posted in 24 hours using the hashtag #TransDocFail. Alongside Sarah Brown and Zoe O'Connell, I helped gather evidence for over 100 specific complaints which we presented to the GMC. These included allegations of sexual abuse, physical abuse, refusal to treat, threats to withdraw treatment, and inducements to criminal behaviour. 40% of those complaints were about GPs. About a third were unrelated to trans healthcare. And to date, it is not clear that any doctor has been held to account for any one of those complaints. The law and the NHS and the regulators are failing trans people. Chronic underinvestment, refusal to innovate and accept trans people as genuine, all of these are having a detrimental impact on a vulnerable and marginalised group ignored for decades. This has to change. In conference, I urge you to support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. That was indeed Helen's first speech at a federal conference. Would Heather Huller from Waverley please stand by? And I now call Zoe O'Connell from Cambridge, who wishes to speak in favour of the motion.
Good morning, Conference. This motion might be uncontroversial in Liberal circles, but it is still vital. There are many good points in the motion, but I shall address just a few. There is an irony, which would be amusing if it were not so deadly, that intersex children born with visible external nonconformity have nearly unlimited funds thrown at them by doctors without their consent, because they cannot consent, in order to make them conform to some norm. Spin forward 18 years, and funding to undo the damage done in the early years dries up. And funding for trans people who do want treatment gets off the ground not at all. The motion references 18-week waiting lists, but the latest data reveals a minimum 24-week waiting list for services at some clinics, with the maximum time being 292 weeks. That's 16 times the 18-week target. And that's just for initial referral, before we get on to vital prescriptions and surgical interventions. When trans people do finally access healthcare services, we often suffer from what's known as the transsexual cold or the transsexual broken arm. We're not alone in this problem. When we speak to the General Medical Council about this, we were told that other groups, such as those with disabilities, particularly mental health, and intersex people as well, also suffer from this problem. Basically, it goes like this. You go into your doctor, and you go, "Doctor, I've got a broken arm, a bone sticking out of your arm." And the doctor goes, "See from your record that you've got this other medical condition. I think I'll refer you for psychological treatment first." I wish this were untrue, but it does happen in practice. Conference may be slightly surprised to find that psychological intervention for broken arms is often not particularly successful. And I would like to pay tribute, on a separate topic, to the work of Simon Hughes on non-gendered passports, the Lib Dem policy on which is reinforced in point 7 of this motion. To me, this is wider than just a transgender or intersex issue, because as Liberals, there is no reason that the state should be collecting information on people that they're not really going to use. Why does a civil servant care what they presume is between our legs? And why do they need to collect information on this? Finally, the motion does make mention observation of various days coming up and ask for government recognition of this, the next to which is Bisexual Visibility Day on this Wednesday. I hope those of you watching at home, online, and by BBC will wear purple if you're bisexual on Wednesday. And for those of you in Bournemouth, I do hope you'll join us on Bournemouth Pier at 10:30 for a bisexual flash mob. Conference, please support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Would Stephen Watkins from Liberal Youth please stand by? And I now call Heather Huller, who is on the Executive Committee in Waverley and is Membership Development Officer, to speak for the motion.
Good morning, Conference. I fully support all aspects of this motion for its comprehensiveness and its inclusivity. I want to highlight certain changes in the NHS and society to meet the spirit of this motion. Now, of course, you've heard of many of the points that I'm about to embark on, but I hope you'll sit with me. So I want to talk on behalf of the transsexual women I know, particularly my partner, who has spoken here before on previous conference occasions. There are issues of resources that have already been mentioned. There's the attitudes of key NHS players and the commissioning authorities, the whole system around that, and the training, particularly of surgeons. Transsexual women, as we've heard, are required to do a real-life test, number of months, preconditions of hormone treatment therapy. A person who has presented male to family, friends and work colleagues previously is incredibly nervous about their reactions, but determined that this is the right course for them. Great trepidation. The test requires female attire, but without NH funding for electrolysis or any facial surgery to feminize their face. So the practical issue arises. What do they do about stubble at, say, 4 o'clock in the afternoon? It's a real challenge, and the embarrassment is acute. The real-life test is not entered into lightly, but it is required by the medical profession. Any private medical interventions are expensive and therefore not available to all who might want them, one of the reasons for suicidal thoughts. Surely a better approach, one more in line with our policies of treating individuals with respect, is that the individual should lead the process with the NHS, not be put in a straitjacket by powerful NHS professionals as gatekeepers and the system at large. There would be careful explanation of all the stages and their irreversible consequences: electrolysis, hormones, possible gender reassignment surgery, possible facial surgery, etc. The individual should decide which, if any, of these interventions they would receive at each stage of their particular transition. The other point I want to make is about the training and competencies of the key NHS professionals. The UK is not recognised as a leader in this field. I would urge surgeons to study the approach and outcomes of specialists in the USA, Canada and Thailand. Much needs to change. Please support this comprehensive motion that would improve the experience and transitions of male and female transsexuals and also the treatment of intersex individuals. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Heather. Would Sarah Brown from Manchester Gorton please stand by? And I now call Stephen Watkins, who is a representative from Liberal Youth. He also wants to speak for the motion.
I think it's becoming clear quite how uncontroversial this motion is. But I'd really like to stress Zoe's point earlier that no matter how uncontroversial it is, it's important to remember that it is right. This is also my first conference, and I am also quite a recent member. And it is a huge privilege to be able to talk at conference today, though I do understand it's quite a hard motion to talk on. I want to focus on the media. There is one clause of the motion that I particularly want to stress on. I believe it's number 12, that talks about representation. And I think representation is an issue that needs to be talked about a lot more. And what it all comes down to is the identity of gender and sexual minorities, which I believe to be inexorably connected to the media. The only problem is, while the media doesn't particularly care for the nature of the identity of gender and sexual minorities, it cares a great deal for its rate of consumption. And as a result, I feel as if oftentimes our identity is appropriated for much more secondary or tertiary causes. I think this is particularly clear in the media's appropriation of our rights movement to score character assassination points against Tim Farron. But I also think it's clear in the depiction of trans people, which often involves the fetishization of trans suffering in the guise of sympathy. Reforms need to be made in media, and much like feminism, this is a bit of an end goal. Feminism, while all the three of these elements have been present throughout its entire development, began focusing on legal and physical protest, then transferred more to a sort of academic and abstracted system of developing a narrative of the rights of women, and then is now fighting a more subtle and cultural battle, one that I think we need to fight as well. It's worth mentioning, while I don't describe my gender in particularly normal terms, I am not transgender, and so I don't want to represent anyone. But there are two problems that arise from making suffering the foundation of queer identity. The first one is what occurs when our suffering is alleviated. This has happened in previous decades and will continue to happen in decades to come. If suffering is the foundation of who we are, when we cease to suffer, we cease to have an identity. I think this is really, really clear in minorities like my own that are being much less oppressed by the LGBT community, within the LGBT community. You can see people saying, now you have gay marriage, why are you going to Pride? What's the point? Our identity, our uniqueness, and our culture is seen as a temporary inconvenience on the road towards equality, rather than the thing that is going to make it happen. If our identity is going to remain steadfast, there need to be reforms in the way that mainstream media depicts us, real reforms. The second problem is in the mental health of normal, particularly young queer people. And that's what happens when we are looking for our identity. It's something I've been doing for a long time. And if our identity is based on suffering, it's unpleasant to say, but we will seek out suffering to seek our identity. How can someone take me seriously if I am happy? It is something that so many young queer people are having to ask, and it's something that we shouldn't have to ask. And I think the way forward is in media. It's in real reforms in the depictions of us in media. I apologize, I haven't been particularly well prepared. I only woke up an hour ago, but I hope I've been sufficiently eloquent. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, and congratulations on your first speech at the Federal Conference. The final speaker in our debate is going to be Sarah Brown from Cambridge. The speakers I'm going to call before the end are going to be Sarah Brown from Manchester Gorton, then Dave Page, also from Manchester Gorton, and then Sal Brinton from Watford, in that order. So would they all stand by, please, to be called. I now call Sarah Brown from Manchester Gorton to speak for the motion.
Thanks. Conference, I'm neither trans nor intersex, and I cannot claim to be an expert. Oh, come on, iPad. I cannot claim to be an expert on this issue. However, I feel it's my duty to stand up for the rights of our trans and intersex friends who've consistently backed others on their fights for equality. As someone who also suffers with my mental health, I want to raise the issue of mental health within the trans and intersex communities. Firstly, I just want to say gender dysphoria is not a mental illness. It's a mismatch between the gender you were assigned at birth and the gender that you believe yourself to be. However, there is a strong correlation between having gender dysphoria and suffering from mental health issues as a result. Waking up every morning in what you feel is the wrong body is hard. It puts a massive strain on that person. Going through puberty of a gender that you do not feel you are also is very distressing, and coming out as trans to a family who may turn their back on you is also really difficult. All of this on top of having to wait in some cases over a year to even get your first appointment at a gender identity clinic. That's if your GP even thinks you have a problem. Many GPs don't think that this is something that should be treated on the NHS. Conference, it's not a surprise that mental health issues creep in, but that doesn't mean it's acceptable or an inevitability. As someone who suffers with my mental health, I can empathise with these feelings of depression, but I cannot comprehend how hard it must be to wait so long before treatment is forthcoming. Conference, it's important that we do all we can to support trans people through their transition, to help them become who they are. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Would Sal Brinton from Watford please stand by? And I now call Dave Page from Manchester Gorton. Dave is chair of LGBT+ Liberal Democrats, and he wishes to speak in favour of the motion. Dave.
Unsurprisingly, I wish to speak in favour of the motion. I happen to be cisgender, I am not transgender. My gender I was assigned at birth is the gender I'm very comfortable in and the gender I feel fits me. That's nice. I would like to talk about my stepson. He's been in my life for about 10 years now, and he's in his mid-20s. And when I first knew him, I didn't know he was trans. He didn't know he was trans. And he was going through that difficult teenage period of rebellion, but it kept going. He had terrible mental health problems. He had dropped out of school, couldn't hold down a job, had to rely on us for financial support, and he was a mess, frankly. He complicated, lengthy and obstacle-strewn path, which the NHS then put in his way, has turned his life around. He is holding down a steady job. He has been in successful long-term relationships. He is a lot happier as a person. What we're talking about in this motion isn't a vanity project. It is about helping individuals get on in life. And if there's one thing we're about as Liberals, it is definitely that. I don't know how many of you saw Sophie in 't Veld's speech yesterday, but one of the things she mentioned was the refugee crisis being political decisions killing people. Political decisions that the Liberal Democrats have opposed and will continue to oppose. Political decisions which forced the Labour government only introduced the Gender Recognition Act because they were worried about losing a court case in the European Court of Human Rights. These decisions are killing people. And it's important for us as Liberal Democrats to stand up proud for those who are affected by these decisions, whether we are personally involved or not. And this is also why we must stop the Tories from trying to scrap or water down the Human Rights Act. Because if there's anyone whose human rights are likely to be affected by that, it's the human rights of minorities, such as trans and intersex people. I just want to finish by making a quick point made by Leslie J. from the UK chapter of the International Intersex Organisation at our suicide. We are not talking about expenses here. We're talking about saving the NHS money. So even if you don't respect people's human rights to be who they are, think of the money. Thank you, and please support the motion.
Thank you, Dave. Conference, our final speaker is going to be Sarah Brown from Cambridge, so would she stand by? Before her, I'm going to call Sal Brinton, who was our party president, who is from Watford, and she too wishes to speak for the motion as a whole. Sal. I think we need the microphones on, please, for Sal.
What's happening?
I wonder if we can sort a handheld microphone out for Sal, or maybe a radio mic.
I'm just coming up. No, it's woken up.
Brilliant.
Okay, I will now reposition myself. I apologise for the delay. This motion expresses very well the problem.
There
Sorry,
we are.
Jeff.
Oh, yes, there we are. That's better. It's Monday morning conference. All a bit groggy in the morning, especially the equipment. Sal.
Right, take two. This motion explains very well the problems that transgender and intersex people in the UK face on a day-to-day basis. But just before I make a couple of comments about that, I also want to reflect on the important work that the Liberal Democrats did in the passing of the same-sex marriage bill during the coalition government. And without Lynn Featherstone and Liz Barker in the Lords, we would not have had the easy passage that we did. Now, that easy is an interesting word because it wasn't quite that easy. And for all the reasons that many of you will know, we cannot call it an equal marriage bill. We did not sort out spousal veto, but Liz Barker is championing on your behalf the continued fight for it. And as I was privileged to be alongside her on the front bench of that bill, and I know I'm not alone. However, we are a very small number of people in Parliament who really understand the issue. And that is part of the problem for the entire LGBTI community in this country. And that is that most people, particularly most politicians, don't know, don't understand, don't want to face up to the issues. Now, I want to focus on transgender and intersex children and how important the Charter is for them. For many years, when I was Chair of Education in Cambridgeshire in the early 90s, I fought against bullying in schools. We had the first comprehensive training system for teachers so that every school had a teacher trained in bullying. But that was during the days of Section 28. You were not even allowed as a teacher to talk about homophobic bullying because you weren't allowed to speak about LGBTI issues at all. Thank goodness Section 28 has gone. And to be honest, even Stonewall has been slow on this. Their campaigns have focused on homophobia and not on TG&I. Now, in the couple of weeks, in the run-up to conference, I have talked to people about this motion being on the agenda, and two completely separate people have said to me, we have intersex children in our families, and we've never been able to say it. So one of the really important things about this motion is starting that dialogue. And this motion with the Health Charter, I'm so pleased that the activists are already talking to the GMC and to the medical profession. We now need to broaden that debate so that families with intersex children, and importantly, intersex children and adults themselves, feel they are able to explain the position they are in. And as Zoe said right at the start, if you have a broken arm, you deserve to get the medical support and society's support to get it mended. Well, frankly, transgender community and intersex people in our society deserve that recognition and support as well. This charter is the baseline for that support to start. I am so proud that the Liberal Democrats are able to present it, and so proud that the Liberal Democrats will lead the way in making it happen. Support the motion.
Thank you very much indeed, Sal. Conference, after our next and final speaker, will be moving to a vote, so please have your voting badges ready for that. To submit on the motion, I now call Sarah Brown from Cambridge, who's an executive member of LGBT plus Liberal Democrats.
Good morning, Conference. The state of transgender healthcare in this country is a complete pig's ear. The state of healthcare for intersex people is far worse. At the first session of the Women and Equalities Select Committee's inquiry into transgender issues a couple of weeks ago, one MP asked if she went to her GP and explained that she'd been struggling with her gender identity and needed help, how long before she would get any kind of treatment? And she didn't get a clear answer to that, so I'll give one. The answer is years. Years. And that's for a prescription of HRT drugs, which are basically harmless and cost about as much as ibuprofen. This happens because of systematic neglect by the NHS. It happens because of pig-headed commissioners who would rather squander their budgets on the worsening mental health of trans people desperate for treatment while they wait years and while their lives collapse around them. They'll spend 2-3 times as much as it would cost to cure people to keep them in a state of distress. It happens because clinicians working at the front line have told me that they do not get the support they need from their trusts. They are overworked and under-resourced, that other clinicians think they're wasting their time working with a bunch of weirdos. A recent study revealed that the most dangerous time for a transgender person is immediately after they have requested treatment, because that's the point at which the dam has burst and the thing they've been suppressing for years and years has gushed through. If denied help at this point, the study found that 50% of trans people will try to kill themselves. Medical neglect of trans people is pushing them into suicide. But however badly transgender people have it, intersex people have it worse in many ways. We've heard about how they're mutilated as babies, often based on whether the length of their sex organ passes an arbitrary threshold. The scalpel then ham-fistedly assigns them as boys if it's beyond a certain length, and as girls if it's not. This often sterilises them in the process. Their parents are told not to discuss it with them as they grow up. They're then treated with further surgeries and a cocktail of hormones to try and force them into the gender role that medics chose for them at birth. And then at 18, when they are often suffering from a litany of health problems and traumatised by what has been done to them, funding dries up. Those who subsequently seek gender reassignment to try and fix what was done to them often have a harder time accessing it than trans people do. Trans people who, ironically, have almost no access to medical intervention before they are 18. We have heard that trans people are treated poorly by equalities law, that it's legal to fire us, that it's legal to sack us from certain jobs, that it's difficult to gain legal recognition, and even that process is subject to spousal veto. Intersex people have no legal recognition at all. At the LGBT plus Lib Dems fringe yesterday, prior to the debate, we heard intersex people are as common as redheads. The shocking way society treats them represents collective guilty secrets shared by us all. The way the medical community treats both trans and intersex people betrays a medical community that is not learned from the decades it's spent trying to normalise lesbian, gay and bisexual people. Conference, it has to stop, and it has to stop now. Please vote for this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Conference, we're now going to move to a vote on this motion. Can I thank all of our speakers in the debate before we do? In order to vote, could you please get your voting badges and hold the word voting towards me? That's the way to do it so I can see clearly. Could I see all of those, please, in favour of the motion? Thank you. And can I see all those against? That motion is very, very clearly carried. Thank you very much. Thank you all for a fascinating debate, particularly our first-time speakers. Can I thank my aide on the platform, Paul Tilsley, and I now hand the chair over to Joe Foster for the next item, which is Parliamentary Party Reports. Thank you very much.
I wasn't intending anything particularly lengthy. I was just going to thank